A surprising truth most people never consider is this. Some of the most emotionally intelligent individuals in the world often have the smallest social circles. Not because they cannot connect, but because they experience connection on a level that makes shallow interaction difficult to sustain. And here is the twist. What looks like social distance from the outside is often emotional precision from the inside. They are not avoiding people. They are filtering experiences until only what feels real remains. If you have ever noticed someone who is deeply thoughtful, highly sensitive, and emotionally aware, yet only keeps a few close relationships, this will help you understand why.
Pause. Because their social world is not smaller by accident. It is shaped by how deeply they feel and how carefully they choose. There is a specific kind of person who can sit in a room full of people and still feel like they are the only one who is fully awake. Not in a superior way, not in a judgmental way, but in a quiet, internal way, like they are watching life happen through glass while everyone else is inside it. They notice everything, the tone shifts, the small pauses, the energy changes that nobody comments on, and even when they try to fully join in, there is a strange pull back into themselves, not because they dislike people, but because their attention never fully leaves awareness. Over time, this becomes their normal state, a cycle of stepping toward connection and then returning to solitude that feels more honest than anything else. This message is not for everyone, and that is not a dramatic statement, it is simply reality. If your life is full of constant social activity, messages, plans, and always being surrounded by people, this might feel unfamiliar.
But if you have ever sat with your phone in your hand, scrolled through names, and felt nothing real pulling you toward any of them, not sadness or anger, just emptiness and clarity at the same time, then you understand something deeper is going on. It is not about loneliness in the usual sense. It is about not feeling truly met by the connections around you, and quietly wondering why that gap exists, even when people are present. Most people assume that having fewer friends means something went wrong somewhere along the way. They assume you failed at social life, or you were too quiet, too intense, too sensitive, or simply not interesting enough to hold attention. Society teaches that friendship count is a measure of value, like a scorecard you are supposed to improve over time. And when you do not match that expectation, you start to internalize a story that something is missing in you.
But what no one explains clearly is that not all social patterns come from failure. Some come from how deeply a person experiences connection itself, and how difficult it becomes to stay in spaces that feel even slightly artificial or emotionally thin. There is a rare psychological pattern in certain individuals where they are not avoiding people out of fear, but filtering experiences out of clarity. They do not connect less because they cannot connect. They connect less because they cannot stay connected to what feels shallow or unaligned. This is not always understood by others because from the outside, the result looks the same. Fewer friendships, smaller circles, more solitude. But internally, the reason is completely different. It is not avoidance. It is selection. And over time, that selection becomes stricter, not out of bitterness, but out of self-awareness and emotional precision that grows stronger with experience. People with high emotional sensitivity, often described as empaths, experience social reality in a much deeper way than most notice.
They do not just hear words, they register emotional undercurrents at the same time. When someone walks into a room carrying hidden stress or sadness, it is often felt before it is spoken. When a conversation shifts from real expression to performance, they sense the shift immediately, even if nothing obvious changes. Research in neuroscience suggests that highly sensitive individuals process emotional information with greater depth and wider brain engagement, which means their experience of the same room is fundamentally richer, but also more overwhelming and exhausting. Now, think about what that means in everyday interaction. A normal conversation is not just words for them, it is tone, energy, emotional pressure, unspoken expectation, and self monitoring all happening at once. While others may feel relaxed and social, they are often processing multiple invisible layers at the same time.
They notice what is said, what is avoided, what is felt but hidden, and what is being performed rather than expressed. After a while, this creates a type of exhaustion that does not go away with rest alone, because it is not physical fatigue, but emotional overload that builds up quietly over time. This is where people often misunderstand them the most. They assume that having a small social circle means something is broken or missing, like a lack of confidence or a fear of intimacy. But in many cases, it is actually the opposite. It is the result of having experienced enough interactions to clearly recognize what feels real and what does not. When someone repeatedly finds themselves in conversations where they have to shrink, adjust, or filter their natural expression just to maintain comfort in the room, they slowly begin to withdraw, not out of rejection of others, but out of refusal to continuously abandon themselves in order to belong.
Over time, something important happens internally. They begin to notice that being surrounded by people does not automatically remove loneliness. In fact, sometimes it makes it sharper. Because loneliness is not just about physical presence, it is about emotional alignment. When you are with people but still feel unseen, you end up carrying both connection and disconnection at the same time, which can feel heavier than being alone. And once this realization settles in, it changes how you relate to social life completely. You stop measuring connection by quantity and start measuring it by depth, honesty, and emotional truth. This is where a quiet distinction begins to form between isolation and discernment. Isolation is when someone pulls away because connection feels unsafe or overwhelming. It is rooted in fear, and it often leaves a sense of emptiness or longing underneath. Discernment is different.
It is when someone chooses carefully where to place their emotional energy because they understand its value. It is not withdrawal from people, it is withdrawal from what feels inauthentic. And while both may look similar from the outside, internally they feel completely different. One feels like shrinking, the other feels like clarity. For someone with deep sensitivity, discernment becomes a natural outcome over time. They begin to recognize that not every connection is meant to be maintained, and not every relationship deserves equal emotional investment. They stop forcing themselves into spaces where they constantly feel slightly misaligned or drained. Instead, they start valuing the rare connections where they can be fully present without editing themselves. This does not mean they stop caring about people. It means they become more intentional about where their emotional energy actually goes, and that naturally reduces the size of their social world.
There is also a hidden layer to this experience that is rarely spoken about. People with high emotional perception often become the ones others open up to easily. Strangers share personal things with them. Friends rely on their emotional understanding, and they often become the safe space in many relationships. But this creates imbalance over time. They are constantly receiving emotional weight from others while rarely receiving the same depth in return. And because they are used to noticing everything, they also notice this imbalance very clearly, even if they do not always express it out loud. Eventually, this creates a quiet turning point. They begin to understand that their depth of perception is not something that most people will naturally match. Not because others do not care, but because they simply do not experience connection at the same level of emotional resolution. This realization is not bitter, but it is clarifying. It shifts expectations.
It changes what they seek in relationships, and it explains why their circle becomes smaller over time, not due to loss, but due to refinement of what feels genuinely reciprocal and real. So you start to let some of those relationships slowly breathe themselves out, not with anger, not with arguments, not with some dramatic ending. You simply stop feeding energy into spaces where nothing real is growing anymore. And without forcing anything, those connections begin to fade on their own. The circle becomes smaller. And from the outside, people look at that smaller circle and immediately come to the wrong conclusion. They assume you are closed off, difficult, too selective, too demanding, or secretly afraid of being truly known. And the hardest part is how easily that story starts to sound believable, even to you, because when you hear the same explanation about yourself repeated often enough, it starts to feel like truth, even when it is not.
But that conclusion misses something very important. Empaths do not end up with fewer friends because they refuse connection. They end up with fewer friends because they have spent years saying yes to connection at a cost most people never see. They have met people halfway, then further than halfway, then almost all the way just to keep things alive. And over time, they realize something quietly painful but clear. Not all connections are mutual in effort, attention, or emotional presence. So what looks like withdrawal from the outside is actually the result of exhaustion from overgiving in places that never fully gave back. This is not avoidance. It is understanding. It is what happens when someone finally recognizes a repeating pattern through lived experience instead of theory. When you have been in enough one-sided connections, you stop calling it bad luck and start seeing it as information.
And recognizing patterns like this is not the same as giving up on people. It is the moment you stop allowing yourself to disappear inside relationships that never truly held you in return. After this shift, something subtle but powerful begins to change internally. There is a kind of clarity that arrives when you stop chasing connections that constantly drain you. It does not feel bitter or heavy. It feels clean, almost quiet, like a fog lifting after a long time of low visibility. You begin to notice your own preferences more clearly. You understand what actually restores you versus what only distracts you for a while. And most importantly, you start to see the difference between being alone and being lonely, something the world often confuses as the same thing. For an empath, time alone is not emptiness, it is recovery. It is where everything absorbed from the outside world gets processed, settled, and released. It is the only space where there is no need to adjust, no need to perform, no need to manage anyone else's emotional state.
In that space, you are not lacking connection. You are returning to balance. And slowly you begin to understand that this time is not a backup plan for failed relationships. It is a basic emotional requirement, just as real as sleep or food, even if the world rarely treats it that way. When this understanding settles in, something important shifts in how you see your social life. You stop apologizing for having fewer connections, not because you stop valuing people, but because you stop believing that value is measured by quantity. You begin to understand that one real connection, where you do not have to shrink, edit, or filter yourself, holds more emotional truth than dozens of surface-level interactions that require you to constantly manage how you appear. That is the real shift. And once it happens, everything before it starts to make sense in a different way.
All the faded friendships, all the quiet withdrawals, all the moments where you felt something was slightly off but could not explain it clearly at the time, they stop looking like failure and start looking like alignment. Not everything was meant to continue. Not every connection was meant to last. Some were only meant to show you what does not fit. At the center of this entire experience sits a question that most empaths rarely ask directly, but feel deeply in almost every relationship they have ever had. It is not, why do I have so few friends? That is only the surface. The deeper question is this: why does being truly known feel so rare, even when I work so hard to understand others? That gap between how deeply you see people and how rarely you feel equally seen is where most of the emotional weight comes from.
And until that gap is understood clearly, it gets misinterpreted as something wrong with you personally rather than what it actually is, a mismatch between your depth of perception and the general structure of how most social connection is built. Most friendships are formed through proximity, repetition, shared environments, and routine interaction. They grow sideways through shared experience over time. And for many people, that is enough. It creates familiarity, comfort, and a sense of belonging. But for someone who naturally processes people at a deeper emotional level, that is not enough. Even from a young age, before you have the language to explain it, you are not satisfied by surface connection alone. You are drawn to what is underneath. You want to understand what people are actually feeling when they are not performing.
You want honesty that exists beyond small talk, beyond social roles, beyond polished versions of people that appear in everyday interaction. This creates a completely different direction of connection. While most people build relationships horizontally through shared surface experiences, you are constantly reaching for something vertical, something deeper, something that goes beneath the visible layer into what is real and unfiltered. But the world is not structured for that kind of connection. It is built for efficiency, comfort, and social ease. It rewards communication that stays light, predictable, and manageable. It does not naturally support depth in most everyday spaces. So every time you try to move deeper in a space designed for surface level interaction, you meet resistance. It is not always direct rejection. It is subtle. A subject change, a laugh that redirects the conversation, a shift in energy that pulls things back to safer ground. And you feel that shift immediately. Not as a thought, but as a sensation, like something quietly closing. And over time, you learn from these moments.
You start to understand who can hold depth and who cannot, not through judgment, but through repeated experience. Eventually, this creates a natural sorting process in your life. You stop forcing depth where it is not welcomed. You stop stretching yourself into conversations that require you to stay smaller than you are. And you begin to keep close only those rare connections where depth is not avoided, but shared. From the outside, this looks like distance. It looks like shrinking social life. It looks like withdrawal. But from the inside, it feels like relief. Like finally not having to translate yourself into something easier for others to digest. And in that space, something very important begins to return: your own voice. Not the version of you that manages impressions, not the version that adjusts to keep conversations smooth, but the version of you that thinks deeply, feels fully, and notices things others often miss.
The more space you give that version of yourself, the more stable you become internally, even if your external world looks quieter. This is where the misunderstanding begins to break. A smaller circle is not always a sign of disconnection. Sometimes it is a sign of clarity, a sign that you are no longer willing to trade your emotional truth for social convenience. And once that understanding settles in, the question is no longer about how many people are around you. It becomes about how real the connection actually is when they are there. Not something to be proud of. It is not loud pride, not the kind that needs to be shown or defended, but a quiet kind of respect for your own internal truth, the kind that comes from knowing you did not abandon yourself just to stay included. And that matters more than most people will ever understand. Because if you look closely, most people are not actually chasing connection in the way they think they are.
They are chasing comfort, familiarity, distraction, social rhythm, something to fill silence so it does not force reflection. But what you have been moving toward, even when it felt like distance, is something different. You have been moving toward clarity, toward connection that does not require self-erasure, toward relationships where you are not constantly editing your presence just to be accepted in the room. And yes, that path is slower. It is less crowded. It has long stretches where nothing seems to be happening on the surface. But underneath, something very important is forming. A deeper understanding of who you are without external noise shaping it. A sharper sense of what feels real and what only looks like connection from a distance. And once that understanding settles in, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to confusing attention with understanding or presence with real connection.
This is also where the emotional weight of the journey becomes more honest, because there are moments when the silence is not peaceful. There are moments when it feels heavy, when there is no one immediately available to share something with, when an experience lands inside you and stays there longer than you expected. Those moments are real, and pretending they do not exist does not help. But they do not cancel out the deeper truth either. They are part of the same reality that also includes depth, authenticity, and rare but meaningful connection. What most people never see is that this kind of life is not empty. It is selective, and selection always has both sides. It removes noise, but it also reduces volume. It removes superficial connection, but it also removes easy access to constant social stimulation. So of course there are quiet days. Of course there are gaps. But inside those gaps is also something most people rarely experience: the ability to hear your own thoughts clearly without interruption.
And in that clarity, something subtle begins to strengthen. You stop outsourcing your sense of reality to other people's reactions. You stop measuring your emotional experience by how well it is received. You stop adjusting your internal world just to match external comfort. And slowly, without even announcing itself, a more stable version of you begins to form. Not a performance, not a role, but a presence that is consistent whether anyone is watching or not. This is why the empath's small circle is often misunderstood. It is not simply about who stayed and who left. It is about what kind of space you are now willing to live inside. A space where your thoughts do not have to be simplified to be accepted. A space where silence does not feel like rejection. A space where connection is not something you constantly have to earn through emotional effort or self-editing. And when even one relationship exists inside that kind of space, something changes.
It becomes more valuable than dozens of connections built on performance and adjustment, not because you have stopped valuing people, but because you finally understand what it means to be fully present with someone without losing yourself in the process. That experience is rare enough that when it happens, it reshapes your entire understanding of what friendship is supposed to feel like. So the question is not how many people are around you. The question is what kind of access they have to you and what kind of access you have to yourself when they are there. Because some relationships increase your clarity and others slowly blur it. And over time, without force or decision, you begin to choose the ones that keep you clear. And that choice is not a rejection of the world. It is a reorganization of your energy.
It is deciding that your emotional life is not something to be scattered across every available connection, but something to be placed carefully where it is actually received, understood, and held with care. There is a quiet confidence that grows from that kind of living, not the confidence of being socially everywhere, but the confidence of knowing where you actually belong. And it does not eliminate loneliness entirely, because nothing does, but it changes its meaning. Loneliness stops being a sign that something is wrong with you and starts becoming a signal that something real has not yet arrived. And that changes everything about how you wait, how you connect, and how you see yourself in the meantime. So when you look at the whole picture, It comes down to something very simple and very honest. Having a small circle is not a sign that something is missing in you.
It is often the result of you being more aware of what connection actually feels like and no longer accepting relationships that only work on the surface. It is the outcome of choosing depth over noise, even when that choice feels quieter and less understood by others. Yes, there are moments of silence. Yes, there are gaps where life feels less socially full than what the world says it should look like. But inside that space, there is also something steady being built, a clearer understanding of yourself, a stronger sense of what is real, and a more honest relationship with your own thoughts and emotions. The truth is, not every connection is meant to stay, and not every empty space is a problem to fix. Sometimes it is just space for clarity, for self-understanding, and for the right people to eventually enter without forcing anything. And in the end, the most important thing is not how many people are around you, but how real you are with yourself when no one else is there.